A millionaire confined to a wheelchair meets a hungry girl who makes an impossible promise. He laughs, but in an instant, something begins to change forever. The fine rain fell on the streets of Philadelphia, transforming the streetlights into trembling reflections on the wet asphalt. The sound of hurried cars echoed between the downtown buildings, while Richard Donovan, millionaire and owner of one of Pennsylvania's largest technology companies, silently observed the city through the window of his luxury car. At 47, he had achieved everything most people would dream of: money, influence, recognition. Still, since the accident that had confined him to a wheelchair, none of that seemed to have value. The man who once symbolized energy and vision for the future now found himself reduced to bitterness, feeding on resentments and the sense of helplessness that accompanied him daily. That night, after a dinner with investors that brought him little beyond looks of pity, he was preparing to return home when something caught his attention. On a side street near Liberty Square, a child was rummaging through garbage bags. At first glance, it seemed like the routine movement of someone looking for something discarded, but there was something in the scene that forced him to look more carefully. The girl wasn't moving desperately, but methodically. She wore a faded, yellow jacket, too large for her small body, and seemed to carefully select what she found. There was dignity in every gesture, as if she were performing serious work. Walter, the driver, noticed the change in his employer's expression and slowed the vehicle. "Did something happen, sir?" Richard didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the small figure who was now opening a discarded food container. "Stop the car, Walter." The driver obeyed, parking a few meters from the girl. Richard lowered the tinted window and observed more carefully. The rain intensified, but the child seemed indifferent to the water streaming down her already soaked jacket. "That girl is eating leftovers from the restaurant where we were," he murmured, recognizing the packaging from the dinner he had left, practically untouched. For a moment, Richard felt tempted to tell the driver to continue the journey. It wasn't the first time he had seen poverty up close, although in the last 3 years, he had made an effort to avoid any contact with realities other than his meetings, therapies, and voluntary isolation. There was something, however, that prevented him from simply ignoring the scene. The girl raised her eyes from the food, and realizing she was being watched, faced the luxury car without averting her gaze. Instead of the embarrassment Richard expected, she maintained eye contact with a disconcerting firmness. There was something there beyond physical hunger, a kind of hunger for dignity that silently challenged him. Without Richard ordering, "Hit," Walter got out of the car with an umbrella and approached the girl. The exchange of words was brief, but enough for her to stand up and walk with the driver to the vehicle. When the back door opened, Richard found himself face to face with enormous brown eyes that examined him without ceremony. "You left good food on your plate." "It's wasteful," were her first words, pointing to the container in her hands. Walter gave his boss an apologetic look, clearly embarrassed by the small visitor's audacity. "What's your name?" asked Richard, ignoring the comment. "Lily, and your—" "The man in the wheelchair who never smiles." The response, direct and unfiltered, provoked something Richard hadn't experienced for a long time: genuine surprise. He wasn't used to people speaking to him without the excessive care that his condition and social position imposed. "How do you know that?" "My mom cleans rich people's buildings. She saw you on television once and said you were an important man who ended up in a wheelchair. But before the accident, you smiled in photos." Richard looked at Walter, who remained impassive at the wheel, although his glance in the rearview mirror betrayed his curiosity about the unusual conversation. "Does your mother work near here?" "She cleans offices at night. I stay with Mrs. Zoe, but today she had to visit her sick daughter, so I came looking for food alone." The naturalness with which Lily explained her situation contrasted with the gravity of what she was saying. A child of approximately 6 years, alone at night, rummaging through trash in search of food, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Where do you live?" asked Richard, trying to keep his voice neutral. "On the hill. Up there after the big staircase. It's far, but you can see the whole city from there." Lily was referring to Highland Hills, one of Philadelphia's largest slums, visible from almost all points in the central region of the city. And does your mother know you're here? The girl lowered her eyes for the first time. She thinks I'm sleeping at Mrs. Zoe's house. Richard felt a stab of indignation. How could a mother be so irresponsible as to leave a child of that age under such precarious care? But there was something in the situation that prevented him from judging hastily. He himself, with all his resources, lived in a chosen solitude, surrounded only by employees paid to meet his needs. "Are you hungry?" he finally asked. Lily shrugged. "I already found food, but you look like you are." "What do you mean?" "Hungry? For a living. You have sad eyes like the abandoned dog we adopted up on the hill." The comparison, made with the innocent cruelty that only children possess, hit Richard like a physical blow. It was then that something unexpected happened. The girl approached the wheelchair and, without asking permission, touched Richard's immobile legs. "Do you want to walk again?" Walter turned around, alarmed by the audacity, but Richard stopped him with a gesture. There was a seriousness in Lily's face that demanded an equally serious response. "The doctors say it's impossible." "Doctors don't know everything," she responded with simplicity. "My mom says they study from books, but life teaches things that aren't written down." A bitter smile formed on Richard's lips. "And you think you know more than the doctors?" Lily wasn't intimidated by the ironic tone. "I know you can walk, you just forgot how." "And how do you propose to remind me?" It was then that the proposal emerged with the disconcerting naturalness that only a child could have. "If you give me food, I'll show you how to walk again." Richard couldn't contain a dry laugh devoid of humor. "And what do you know about walking, little Lily?" The girl stared at him with an intensity that seemed misplaced in someone so young. "I know that it's not just with your legs that you walk." Something in that simple phrase touched Richard in a way he hadn't expected. Behind the apparent naivety, there was a wisdom that disarmed him. He looked at the soaked child holding leftover food, proposing an impossible deal with the seriousness of someone offering a valuable treasure. "Walter, take us to a restaurant. Lily needs a decent meal." As the car moved away from Liberty Square, Richard couldn't explain why he had accepted that absurd situation. Perhaps it was just the need for a distraction in his monotonous routine, or perhaps something deeper that he still couldn't name. In any case, he felt that this unexpected encounter could be the beginning of something that would change his life forever. What Richard didn't imagine was that, by accepting that improbable proposal, he was taking the first step on a journey that would lead him far beyond what he had ever dreamed. A journey that began with a simple question asked by a girl in a yellow jacket on a rainy night in Philadelphia. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll continue. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll continue. The restaurant chosen by Walter was in the Westbrook area, a discreet but elegant establishment where Richard wouldn't risk running into acquaintances at that hour of the night. The presence of a child in simple, wet clothes next to one of Pennsylvania's most influential businessmen would certainly generate comments he preferred to avoid. Lily looked at everything with contained curiosity, as if not wanting to show amazement. Her eyes scanned the details of the decoration, the indirect lighting, the flower arrangements on the tables, but her hands remained quiet on her lap, in a posture that betrayed an unusual self-control for her age. "You can choose whatever you want," said Richard, handing her the menu. The girl examined the pages attentively, frowning at the elaborate descriptions of the dishes. "Do you have rice and beans?" The question, asked with seriousness, provoked an involuntary smile from Richard. It was the first time he had smiled spontaneously in months. "Of course, let's order rice, beans, steak, and French fries, and a dessert afterward. What do you think?" Lily's eyes sparkled at the mention of dessert, but she contained her excitement. "Can I take some for my mom?" The question hit Richard as a reminder of that child's reality. While he maintained an isolated existence by choice, many lived isolated from abundance by circumstances they didn't control. "Yes, we'll take something for your mother, too." During dinner, Richard observed how Lily ate with surprising composure. There was no voracity despite the evident hunger. Each forkful was savored with a silent gratitude that made him question his own habits. How many meals had he ignored, or barely touched in recent years? How many times had he ordered expensive dishes only to leave them half-eaten as he had done that night? "Why don't you smile anymore?" Lily asked, suddenly interrupting his thoughts. Richard hesitated. How could he explain to a child the emptiness that had settled in him since the accident? How to talk about the feeling of having lost not only the movements of his legs, but his very identity? "I think I forgot how to do that." "How does someone forget how to smile?" "You just lift the corners of your mouth," she replied, demonstrating with an exaggerated smile that made her cheeks rise comically. Richard observed that small face transform with the smile and felt a pang of envy. The simplicity with which Lily faced life, despite the evident difficulties, contrasted with the complexity of his own feelings. "Some things are more difficult for adults," he finally replied. "Why?" "Because growing up means carrying more weight." Lily seemed to reflect on the answer, slowly chewing the last piece of meat. "My mom carries weight all the time, shopping bags, water buckets, the grocery cart, but she still smiles when she sees me." The observation, made without any intention to judge, made Richard feel strangely ashamed. Who was he to indulge in self-pity when people like Lily's mother faced much greater difficulties without losing the ability to smile? "Your mother must be a special woman. She's the strongest person in the world. She works in 3 different places and still has time to tell me stories before bed." The waiter approached with dessert, an elaborate construction of chocolate and red berries that made Lily's eyes widen. "What's your name?" asked Richard, as the girl contemplated the sweet. "I already told you. Lily." "Your full name?" "Lily. Marie Johnson. The middle name is the same as my mom's." "And how old are you, Lily Marie?" 6.5 years old. I'll be 7 next month." As Lily attacked the dessert with the same surprising control she had demonstrated throughout the meal, Richard tried to understand what he was doing. Why had he brought that child to dinner? What did he intend to do afterward? Take her back? Home? What if her mother wasn't there? The situation, which had begun as an inexplicable impulse, now demanded concrete decisions. "Your mother must be worried about you," he commented, checking his watch. It was after 10 at night. "She only returns from work at 5 in the morning. Mrs. Zoe is the one who must be worried because I didn't come back." The naturalness with which Lily talked about her precarious routine disconcerted Richard. How could such a small child accept such a harsh reality with so much maturity? "I'll ask them to pack something for you to take to your mother, and then Walter will take you home." "Will you come with me?" The question caught Richard by surprise. The idea of visiting a community like Highland Hills, especially at night and in his condition, seemed absurd. Still, he felt tempted to learn more about the world from which this extraordinary child came. "Not tonight, Lily, but I promise we'll see each other again." The brightness in her eyes visibly diminished, but she nodded with an acceptance that seemed very adult. "Okay, but you remember our deal, right? I'll show you how to walk again." Richard smiled, this time without bitterness. "I remember. I'm curious to see how you'll fulfill that promise." On the way to Highland Hills, Lily sat silently in the back seat, carefully holding the packages with food that they would take to her mother. From time to time she glanced at Richard, as if evaluating something only she could see. "Do you have family?" she asked suddenly. "I have a sister who lives in New York, and nephews I rarely see." "But you live alone?" "With employees who take care of the house and me." Lily frowned, processing the information. "That must be sad." "What?" "Living only with people who are paid to be with you." The observation, made without malice, deeply affected Richard. It was exactly how he often felt, surrounded by people but essentially alone. As the car climbed the steep streets that led to Highland Hills, the urban landscape transformed. The elegant buildings gave way to simple constructions, often unfinished. That piled up on the hillside. The well-paved streets became increasingly narrow, some accessible only on foot. "We have to stop here," Walter informed, parking where the street still allowed the passage of vehicles. The rest of the way is by staircase. Richard looked at the steep stairs that climbed up the hill and felt the familiar discomfort he experienced whenever he encountered physical barriers insurmountable for his wheelchair. "I can go alone from here," Lily offered, noticing his embarrassment. "I know every stone on the path." "Walter will go with you to your door," Richard insisted. "I want to be sure you'll arrive safely." The driver nodded, accustomed to following orders without question. He got out of the car and opened the door for Lily, who jumped out with the agility characteristic of her age. Before leaving, she approached Richard's window. "Will you come back?" she asked, an unexpected vulnerability showing in her voice. "I will, and we'll continue our deal." The smile that illuminated Lily's face at that moment caused a strange sensation in Richard, as if something long dormant were beginning to awaken within him. "Tomorrow I'll be in the square after school. If you come, I'll start teaching you to walk." Richard nodded, unable to find words to respond. He watched as Lily and Walter moved away toward the stairs, the small figure in the yellow jacket skipping ahead of the formal driver, as if guiding, a foreigner in familiar territory. He remained alone in the car for almost half an hour, contemplating the view of the city that spread below, dotted with lights. Philadelphia seen from there seemed different, more real and less distant than when observed from the window of his penthouse apartment or the office on the top floor of the building that housed his company. When Walter returned, he wore a thoughtful expression that was unusual for him. "The girl lives in very simple conditions, sir, but the house is clean and organized, despite the mother's absence." "Was anyone there?" "An elderly lady who lives next door. It seems she keeps an eye on the girl when the mother isn't around. She was quite relieved to see Lily, said she was worried about her disappearance." Richard nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and concern. Part of him wanted to forget that unusual encounter and return to the predictable safety of his routine. Another part, however, yearned to discover more about that extraordinary child and the world from which she came. "Tomorrow afternoon, I want you to take me to Liberty Square." Walter raised his eyebrows, surprised by the unexpected order. "You have the meeting with the administrative board at 3. Cancel it. Say I'm not feeling well." The driver nodded, accustomed to the discretion his job required. He wouldn't ask questions about the sudden change in his boss's habits, nor about the interest in an unknown child. However, he couldn't help but notice that, for the first time in 3 years, Richard Donovan seemed truly interested in something beyond his own bitterness. As the car descended the hill toward the neighborhood where Richard lived, the businessman couldn't stop thinking about Lily's words. "It's not just with your legs that you walk." What had that child, in her innocent wisdom, perceived that he, with all his experience and resources, couldn't see? That night, unlike previous ones, Richard fell asleep without the usual feeling of emptiness. In its place, there was an almost forgotten curiosity, the expectation of a tomorrow that, for the first time in a long time, seemed worth living. Liberty Square, the cultural heart of Philadelphia, displayed its imposing architecture under the afternoon sun when Richard's car parked near the central gazebo. The place, which had once been the seat of Pennsylvania's political power, now housed museums and cultural centers that attracted tourists and locals, especially on weekends. On a Wednesday like that, however, the movement was tranquil, with some students scattered on benches and elderly people enjoying the shade of the century-old trees. Richard checked his watch. 3:15 in the afternoon. The same time he should have been starting the meeting with his company's administrative board. He felt a pang of guilt for the abrupt cancellation, something unprecedented in his career, but pushed away the feeling with surprising ease. For Sue, the first time in years, there was something that seemed more urgent than spreadsheets, reports, and corporate decisions. "Do you want me to help you get down?" asked Walter, interrupting his thoughts. "Yes, and bring the chair." The ritual was always the same. Walter would remove the wheelchair from the trunk, open it next to the passenger door, and, with a contained strength that preserved his boss's dignity, help Richard transfer from the car seat to the mobile prison his chair had become. The first months after the accident had been a painful adaptation to this new reality, but now both men's movements were coordinated by a silent and efficient choreography. Once settled, Richard observed the square, looking for the small figure in the yellow jacket. There was no sign of Lily. "Do you want me to look for her, sir?" offered Walter. "No, we'll wait here." The minutes dragged on, turning into almost an hour of waiting. Richard was beginning to feel ridiculous. What was he doing there? Waiting for a child who had probably already forgotten the promise made the night before. Or worse, who might have invented that meeting as a childish prank at the expense of the rich man in the wheelchair. He was about to ask Walter to take him away when he spotted Lily running in his direction. She wasn't wearing the yellow jacket, but a simple school uniform, white shirt, navy blue skirt, and knee-high socks. She carried a backpack that seemed too big for her small body, and her curly hair was tied in two impeccable braids. "You really came," she exclaimed, breathless from running. Her face displayed a mixture of surprise and joy that made Richard wonder how many times adults had broken promises made to that child. "I said I would come." "Most adults say things they don't do," Lily replied with a wisdom that didn't match her age. "Sorry I'm late. The teacher asked me to stay after class to show my essay to the principal." There was pride in her voice, and Richard felt curious. "Did you write something special?" "We were supposed to write about our biggest dream. I wrote that I wanted to be a doctor to heal people who can't walk. The principal said it was very well written for a first-grade student." The coincidence, if it was just a coincidence, made Richard smile. There was something mysterious about the way that girl had appeared in his life exactly when he needed it most, although he didn't know it. "And does this dream have anything to do with our deal?" Lily nodded emphatically. "I promised I'd teach you to walk again, remember?" "I remember, and I'm curious to know how you plan to do that." The girl looked around, as if searching for a suitable place to begin her unlikely lesson. Her eyes lit up upon spotting a space under a large tree away from the main path. "There, let's go under that tree." Walter, who had remained discreetly a few steps away, approached to push the chair, but Lily stopped him with a gesture. "He needs to learn to go by himself." The driver looked at Richard, awaiting instructions. After a moment of hesitation, the businessman nodded. "It's okay, Walter. You can give us some time alone." As the driver moved away, Richard propelled the chair by the wheel rims, heading to the location indicated by Lily. The task, which for many would be simple, required considerable effort from him on the squares. Uneven surface, each small obstacle, an exposed root, a crack in the pavement, represented a challenge that painfully reminded him of his limitations. "You're doing well," encouraged Lily, walking by his side. "Here's just the beginning." When they finally reached the shade of the tree, Richard was slightly out of breath from the effort. Lily sat on the grass in front of him, crossing her legs in a lotus position with the naturalness of children. "Now, tell me about the accident." The direct question, without any preparation, caught Richard off guard. In the 3 years since the accident, few people had dared to approach the subject so frontally. Most got lost in euphemisms and embarrassment, treating his condition as a taboo that could only be mentioned indirectly. "Why do you want to know about that?" "Because to learn to walk again, you need to remember when you stopped." There was surprising logic in that simple explanation. Richard breathed deeply, organizing thoughts he rarely allowed to come to the surface. "It was 3 years ago. I was in New York, returning from an important meeting. It was raining heavily, like the night we met. The driver lost control of the car on a curve." "No," interrupted Lily, shaking her head firmly. "I don't want to know what happened to the car. I want to know what happened to you." Richard frowned, confused. "I don't understand what you mean. When did you realize you wouldn't walk anymore? What did you feel? What did you think?" The question, in its childish simplicity, hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. No one, not even the therapists who had accompanied him, had formulated the question exactly that way. I was in the hospital." The doctors entered the room, many of them, all with serious expressions. They explained about the spinal cord injury, about the compromised vertebrae. They used technical terms, talked about statistics and possibilities for rehabilitation. Lily listened attentively, her large eyes fixed on Richard's face. And then one of them, the oldest, said the phrase that changed everything. "Sir, you need to prepare for the possibility of never walking again." It was at that moment that I knew Not from his words, but from the certainty I felt inside me. What did you feel? Richard closed his eyes, reliving that instant with painful clarity. Anger. An anger so great that it seemed it would consume me from within. Anger at the doctor, at the driver, at the car, at the rain, at myself. And then when the anger diminished came the emptiness, as if something fundamental had been torn from me. Not just the ability to walk, but something more, essential. When he opened his eyes again, he found Lily observing him with a solemn expression that seemed misplaced on her childish face. The anger is still there, isn't it? That's why you can't walk. Lily, my injury is physical. It's not a matter of emotion. Or will. My mom says that the body and the heart are connected. When the heart is sick, the body gets sick too. Richard smiled indulgently. Your mother seems wise, but there are medical realities that can't be overcome just with positive thinking. Lily wasn't shaken by the condescending tone. Did you try to walk again after the accident? I did too. Years of intensive physical therapy. 3 sessions a week with the best specialists. I tried experimental treatments even abroad. Nothing worked. But you gave up. It wasn't a question, but a calm statement that, precisely because of its simplicity, deeply affected Richard. It wasn't giving up. It was accepting reality. No, you gave up, insisted Lily, and when we give up, the body obeys. There was such a strong conviction in her voice that, for a moment, Richard almost believed her. He almost allowed a spark of hope, long extinguished, to rekindle in his chest. What do you suggest then, Dr. Lily? He asked, trying to maintain a light tone to disguise the turmoil of emotions the conversation had awakened. The girl stood up and extended her hands to him. First, we have to get you out of that chair. Richard felt a shiver of apprehension. That's not a good idea. Do you promise you'll try? It's our deal. I gave you food, now you have to try to walk. There was something in the implacable logic of that child that disarmed all the defenses carefully built by Richard. Against his better judgment, he nodded. All right, but we'll need Walter's help. With a gesture, he called the driver, who quickly approached. After brief instructions, Walter helped Richard transfer from the chair to the grass, where he sat leaning against the tree trunk. Lily observed the entire process attentively, noting how Richard moved the upper part of his body with strength and precision, while his legs remained immobile, dragged like disconnected appendages. Now, she said, when they were finally sitting side by side on the grass, we'll really begin. 2. Richard's surprise, Lily made no attempt to make him stand up or move his legs. Instead, she sat in front of him and began to tell a story. When I was very little, I was afraid to climb stairs. I thought I would fall and hurt myself. One day, my mom taught me a secret. Before climbing with your legs, you have to climb with your thoughts. What do you mean? We close our eyes and imagine each step, each movement. Feel the foot touching the next step. Feel the body rising. When we can do this properly in our head, the body learns to do it too. Richard watched, fascinated by the seriousness with which Lily explained her childish theory. And did it work for you? Yes. Now I climb all the stairs on the hill without fear. I even help smaller children who have the same problem. And you think this can help me walk again? Lily nodded emphatically. But you have to truly believe. You can't just pretend. There was something touching about that child's unwavering conviction. Richard felt an unexpected tenderness, mixed with a pang of envy for the simplicity with which she faced challenges. Let's try then. What should I do? Close your eyes, breathe deeply like the teacher teaches in meditation class, and remember what it was like to walk before the accident. Richard obeyed, feeling simultaneously ridiculous and hopeful. He closed his eyes and tried to evoke the sensation of walking, the weight of the body transferring from one leg to the other, the contact of the feet with the ground, the swinging of the arms accompanying the movement. Is it working? Asked Lily after a few minutes. I don't know. I can remember the sensation, but it seems distant, like the memory of a dream. It's a beginning, she replied with optimism. Tomorrow we'll try again, and the day after tomorrow too, until your body remembers. The simplicity of the plan contrasted with its improbability. Still, Richard didn't have the heart to dispel Lily's enthusiasm with the weight of his adult disbelief. Deal. But now I think it's time to take you home. Your mother must be worried. My mum only returns from work at 7 today. We still have time. Even so, I'd like to meet her, may I? Lily seemed to hesitate for the first time. She doesn't like receiving visitors much. I understand. Maybe another day then. No, it's okay. She'll like to meet you. You're different from the other rich men whose messes she cleans up. The observation, made without any malice, provoked an uncomfortable sensation in Richard. What would his life look like through the eyes of someone like Lily's mother? How would a woman who spent her days cleaning up the traces left by people like him view a bitter businessman in his expensive wheelchair? Are you sure we won't bother her? I'm sure. And you can bring food again. She really liked last night's dinner. Walter helped Richard return to the wheelchair, and the three headed to the car. On the way back to Highland Hills, Lily talked animatedly about her school, her friends, the books she liked to read, revealing a rich inner world that contrasted with the simplicity of her material life. As he listened to her, Richard realized that something subtle had changed within him. The bitterness that had faithfully accompanied him for the last 3 years seemed to have receded, if only slightly, giving space to an almost forgotten sensation, curiosity about the world beyond himself. The car climbed the steep streets that led to the housing project, again reaching the point where the road became inaccessible to vehicles. This time, however, Richard wasn't content to wait in the car. I want to go to Lily's house, he announced, surprising both Walter and himself. Sir, the staircases. There must be another way, one that's accessible. Lily, who was listening to the conversation, intervened animatedly. There is. It's longer, but you can go by wheelchair. It's the path that Mr. Anthony uses with his motorized chair. Walter seemed hesitant, but Richard was determined. Following Lily's directions, they went around the hill via a side street, less steep, that wound to an area where small local businesses served the community. The path was challenging. The irregular sidewalks, when they existed, presented constant obstacles, forcing Walter to lift the wheelchair at various points. Richard felt the curious gazes of the residents, some recognizing him from television reports, others simply intrigued by the unusual presence of a clearly wealthy man in that area of the city. Lily, however, seemed oblivious to the buzz they caused. She walked ahead, greeting acquaintances, introducing Richard to some of them with the naturalness of someone who saw nothing strange in the situation. This is my friend Richard. I'm teaching him to walk again. The statement, repeated at each new encounter, was received with polite smiles and looks of understanding directed at Richard, the kind of look that adults exchange when a child says something innocently impossible. When they finally arrived at the small brick house where Lily lived, Richard was exhausted from the effort of maintaining his composure during the rough journey. Still, he felt a strange satisfaction at having managed to get there, overcoming not only the physical barriers, but also the invisible ones he had erected around his life in recent years. Lily's house was surprisingly welcoming. Small, with exposed brick walls in some places, and stucco painted light yellow in others, it conveyed a sense of care and organization that contrasted with the precariousness of the dirt road. In the tiny front yard, some plants in recycled cans formed an improvised garden. The door and windows, although simple, were freshly painted blue, creating a harmonious combination with the yellow facade. "My mum should be arriving," said Lily, consulting a colorful plastic watch on her wrist. "She finishes her afternoon work at 6:30. Richard consulted his own watch, a Patek Philippe that had cost the equivalent of several months of Lily's mother's salary, and noted that it was past 6. An unexpected nervousness took hold of him. What would he say to this woman? How would he explain his presence in her daughter's life? "You can wait out here if you want," offered Lily, noticing his discomfort. "I'll prepare some juice while we wait." The girl disappeared into the house, leaving Richard and Walter in the small yard. The driver maintained a neutral expression, But Richard perceived his discomfort at being so far from their usual safety zone. "Walter, you can wait in the car if you prefer." "No, sir. I'll stay here." Walter's silent loyalty was one of the few constants in Richard's life. Since the accident, the driver had assumed functions that went far beyond simply driving. He was a reliable and discreet presence who helped him navigate the world that had suddenly become hostile to his physical limitations. Lily returned with 2 glasses of passion fruit juice, handing one to Richard and the other to Walter. "My mum makes the best passion fruit juice in the world," she declared proudly. "She picks the fruits in Mrs. Zoe's backyard." Richard tasted the juice, surprised by its intense and natural flavor, so different from the industrialized beverages he usually consumed. "It's delicious, Lily, thank you." The girl's smile upon receiving the compliment illuminated her face in a way that made Richard realize how long it had been since he had genuinely made someone happy. In recent years, his interactions had been limited to professional relationships and functional contact with the employees who surrounded him. When was the last time he had made someone smile like that? The sound of hurried footsteps interrupted his thoughts. A woman turned the corner of the dirt road, walking quickly toward the house. She wore simple clothes, jeans, a white t-shirt, and a thin blouse tied at the waist, and carried a cloth bag on her shoulder. Her curly hair, tied in a practical bun, was identical to Lily's, as were her large, expressive eyes. "Mom!" exclaimed Lily, running to meet her. The woman smiled upon seeing her daughter, but her face assumed an expression of alarm when she noticed the unfamiliar figures in her yard. She hugged Lily protectively while assessing the visitors with a cautious look. "Hi, honey, who are your friends?" There was evident tension in her voice, and Richard couldn't blame her. The unexpected presence of strangers, especially men, at her door was certainly cause for concern for a single mother. "This is Richard, Mom, the man I told you about in the wheelchair who I promised to teach to walk again. And that's Walter, his driver." The embarrassment in the woman's expression was quickly replaced by an understanding that seemed to mix relief and disapproval. "Lily Marie, what have you been up to? I can't believe you bothered this gentleman with your stories." Richard hastened to intervene. "Your daughter hasn't bothered me at all, ma'am. In fact, it was a pleasure to meet her. My name is Richard Donovan, and this is Walter, my driver and assistant." Recognition shone in Melissa's eyes upon hearing the full name. As Lily had mentioned, she probably knew him from television reports or newspapers. "Melissa Johnson," she introduced herself, extending her hand with a formality that contrasted with the environment. "I'm sorry if Lily caused any trouble. She has a very fertile imagination." Melissa's hand was small, but her grip was firm and decisive. Richard noticed calluses on her palms and fingertips, marks of constant physical work that he knew only theoretically. "No trouble at all, believe me. Your daughter is extraordinary company." Melissa looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. She certainly is special, but sometimes she forgets that not everyone has time for her stories and wild plans. "Mum, I'm not making it up. I really am going to teach Richard to walk. We already started today in the park." Melissa gave Richard an apologetic look, but he smiled, indicating there was no problem. "Actually, your daughter gave me a very interesting lesson on visualization and body memory, techniques that my expensive physical therapists never mentioned." The surprise on Melissa's face was evident. She clearly hadn't expected a successful businessman to take seriously the ideas of a 6-year-old child. "Well, Lily has always been observant. I think she pays attention to adult conversations more than we imagine." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "Would you like to come in for coffee? The house is simple, but—" "I'd love to," replied Richard, genuinely interested in seeing the environment where Lily grew up. The small living room to which they were led was an example of intelligent use of space. Their 2-seater sofa covered with a colorful quilt, a modest bookcase filled with carefully organized books, a small table with 3 chairs, and on the wall, some framed photographs of Lily at different ages. The environment breathed care and affection, despite the evident limitation of resources. What most surprised Richard, however, was the number of books. Not just children's books, but works of literature, biographies, some volumes on administration and economics, and even academic texts. It seemed like the collection of someone with a university education, not of a cleaner who had barely completed her studies as he had initially presumed. "Your book collection is impressive," he commented as Melissa prepared coffee in the small adjacent kitchen. A slight blush colored her cheeks. "I've always liked reading, and I want Lily to grow up, surrounded by books, even if our resources are limited." "Mom was studying at the university," Lily informed proudly. "She was going to be a business administrator, just like you." The warning look that Melissa gave her daughter didn't go unnoticed by Richard. There was a story there that she preferred not to share. "I had to interrupt my studies," Melissa explained briefly, placing cups of coffee on the table. "Life sometimes takes unexpected turns." Looking at Lily, who was now proudly showing her school notebooks to Walter, Richard understood the unexpected turn to which Melissa referred. An unplanned pregnancy, probably during college, had completely altered that woman's trajectory. "You never thought about going back to study afterward?" Melissa smiled with a mixture of resignation and determination. "Every day. But between working to support Lily and taking care of her, there's little time left for classes. Hand studies. Maybe when she's older?" There was a silent strength in Melissa that Richard couldn't help but admire. While he had given in to bitterness after a single blow of fate, she faced challenges daily that would make many give up, and still maintained her dignity and hope intact. "I saw you on television once," commented Melissa, changing the subject. "It was a report about technological innovation in Pennsylvania before your accident." Richard nodded, vaguely remembering the mentioned interview. He had given so many during the years of his company's rise that they blended in his memory. "I was a different man at that time," he responded with sincerity. "The accident changed everything?" "I thought so for a long time, but your daughter is making me question that certainty." Melissa observed Lily, who was now drawing something with intense concentration in her school notebook. "She has that effect on people. She sees the world in a way that we adults forget is possible." The conversation flowed with surprising ease after that. Melissa talked about her 3 jobs: cleaning offices in the morning, assistant in a clothing store in the afternoon, house cleaning on weekends. Richard told about the early years of his company, the difficulties and successes that had led him to success. They avoided the topic of the accident, as if both recognized that that wound still needed time to be exposed. At one point, Lily approached and handed Richard a drawing she had just made, a stick figure in a wheelchair next to another stick figure standing, both holding hands under a large yellow sun. "That's us too when you can walk," she explained with the absolute conviction that only children possess. Richard felt a lump in his throat looking at that simple drawing, not for the impossible promise it represented, but for the unwavering faith that child placed in a recovery that science had dismissed years ago. "It's a beautiful drawing, Lily. I'll keep it with care." When they finally said goodbye, it was already night. Lily had fallen asleep on the sofa, exhausted after a day of school and intense emotions. Melissa accompanied Richard and Walter to the small gate. "Thank you for the visit, Mr. Donovan. Please call me Richard, and I'm the one who should thank you for receiving me in your home." A brief hesitation crossed Melissa's face before she spoke what clearly bothered her. "May I ask what your interest in Lily is?" "She's just a child who makes impossible promises." The question, although expected, caught Richard off guard. What was, after all, his interest in that family? What was he seeking on that hill so far from his usual world? "Your daughter asked me a question that no one had asked before," he replied after a moment of reflection. "She asked me why I had given up walking, not how the accident happened, not what the injuries were, but why I had given up. It was revealing." Melissa nodded slowly, as if she understood exactly what he meant. Lily has that ability to go straight to the point that adults avoid. "I'd like to continue seeing your daughter, if you'll allow it. I don't believe she'll make me walk again, but there's something about her company that does me good." Melissa's evaluative gaze was penetrating, as if she could see beyond Richard's words, seeking his true intentions. "I don't want Lily to become attached to someone who will disappear from her life when they tire of this experience. She's already had enough disappointments. There was an untold story in that statement, probably related to Lily's absent father, but Richard didn't feel entitled to ask. I understand your concern, but I promise I'm not treating this as a pastime. Your daughter has awakened something in me that I believed had been dead for a long time. Hope, ventured Melissa. Curiosity, corrected Richard, about the world beyond my own limitations, and maybe, yes, a little hope too. A discreet smile curved Melissa's lips. Welcome back to the world of the living, then. The phrase, said, without any irony, hit Richard with unexpected force. It was exactly how he felt, like someone who, after a long period of hibernation, was beginning to awaken to life again. On the way back home, Richard remained silent, absorbing the impressions of that extraordinary day. The small yellow house with blue windows, the bookcase filled with carefully preserved books, the passion fruit juice served with pride in simple glasses. Everything seemed to offer lessons that his world of luxury and isolation had forgotten to teach. He looked at Lily's drawing, carefully stored in a folder. Those stick figures holding hands under a radiant sun represented a possibility he had completely discarded, that of finding joy and human connection, even without regaining movement in his legs. Walter, he suddenly called, tomorrow I want to go to the company in the morning. There are important meetings I can't continue postponing. The driver nodded, showing no surprise at the sudden return to responsibilities that Richard had neglected in recent days. And in the afternoon? He asked, keeping his eyes on the road. Richard smiled, realizing that Walter already knew the answer. In the afternoon we have an appointment at Liberty Square. As the car descended the hill toward the elegant neighborhoods of the city, Richard realized that the bitterness that had faithfully accompanied him for the last 3 years had given way, if only temporarily, to an almost forgotten sensation. Anticipation for the next day. In the comfort of his penthouse apartment, with a panoramic view of the city that now seemed strangely different, Richard couldn't stop thinking about Melissa. There was something about her that intrigued him, a serene dignity that contrasted with the evident difficulties of her life. It wasn't just her physical beauty, although she was undeniably attractive, but an inner strength that showed through, in every gesture, in every measured word. What would it be like to have that strength? What would it be like to face the world not from a position of power and privilege, but in constant battle against adverse circumstances? And more importantly, how would it be to look at these circumstances not as a definitive prison, but as challenges to be overcome with patience and determination? For the first time in 3 years, Richard fell asleep without needing the medications that had become his routine since the accident. And for the first time in a long time, his dreams were not populated by memories of what he had lost, but by possibilities of what he might still find. The following weeks established a routine that no one, not even Richard himself, could have predicted. In the mornings, he actively resumed command of his company, surprising executives and employees with renewed energy and ideas that had remained dormant during his period of isolation. The afternoons, however, were strictly reserved for meetings, with Lily in Liberty Square or when the weather didn't permit in his comfortable apartment. The walking lessons, as Lily called her unlikely sessions, followed a methodology that blended childish games and intuitive wisdom. While professional physical therapists had focused exclusively on the physical aspects of rehabilitation, the girl insisted on working first on what she called body memory. Close your eyes and remember what it was like to run in the rain, she instructed. Don't think about the chair or the accident. Just remember the feeling of water on your face, the ground under your feet, your heart beating fast. Richard obeyed, initially with skepticism, then with growing surrender. He was surprised by the vividness of the memories he could evoke, sensations long forgotten that Lily, with simple and direct questions, helped bring back. Now move your toes, she commanded, after long visualization sessions. Lily, I can't move my toes. That's what paraplegia means. The girl shook her head with the characteristic impatience of someone explaining something obvious. I'm not asking your body to move. I'm asking you to move. It's different. The distinction, apparently meaningless to a rational adult, began. to make a strange sense to Richard after several sessions. There was, in fact, a difference between trying to move the body and simply experiencing the movement, regardless of the physical result. Melissa observed that unusual relationship with initial caution, which gradually transformed into curiosity and finally into a silent type of hope. Not hope that Richard would walk again, she was too realistic to believe that, but that both he and Lily would extract something valuable from that unlikely friendship. Over time, Melissa also became part of that routine. When she managed to get time off that coincided with Lily and Richard's meetings, she joined them for conversations that extended far beyond the schedule of the lessons. In these moments, Richard discovered more about the extraordinary woman behind the facade of a working mother. Melissa had been a brilliant student, earning a full scholarship in business administration at a prestigious private university. She was in her third year when she became pregnant by a classmate who, upon learning of the pregnancy, simply disappeared from her life. Without support from her conservative family, who didn't accept the pregnancy out of wedlock, she found herself alone with her studies interrupted and the urgent need to secure sustenance for the child that was to come. "I never regretted having Lily," she confessed one afternoon as they walked through the square, while the girl played with other children in the playground. "But sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I had been able to complete college." Richard, who pushed his own chair beside her, reflected on the different types of limitations that life imposes. "You can still go back to studying," he suggested. "There are scholarship programs, financing." Melissa smiled with a mixture of gratitude and resignation. "Nice theory. In practice, between 3 jobs and taking care of Lily, I barely managed to sleep 6 hours a night. When exactly would I attend classes or study?" The practical reality of the obstacles Melissa faced was a constant reminder to Richard of his own privileges. Even with the physical limitation that had embittered him so much, he still had resources that made his life infinitely easier than hers. It was during one of these conversations that an idea began to form in his mind, not in a calculated way, but as a natural evolution of his feelings and observations. "I know I've mentioned this before, but my company has an internship program for business administration students. Many of the interns are later hired with competitive salaries and flexible hours that allow for continued studies." Melissa stopped walking and looked directly at him. "What exactly are you suggesting, Richard?" "I'm suggesting that you consider resuming your studies, and that when you're ready there would be a position waiting for you." Melissa's gaze hardened subtly. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity," replied Richard firmly. "It's recognition of potential. You have impressive analytical reasoning, understand management of scarce resources better than many of my directors, and possess a work ethic that any company would value. It would be a waste of talent not to invest in that." Melissa looked away, visibly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I don't want our friendship to turn into a relationship of dependency, Richard. It wouldn't be healthy for me, for Lily, or for you." There was wisdom in that concern, and Richard respected it. However, something inside him rebelled against the idea that helping Melissa realize her potential would be a way of creating dependency. "I understand your concern, but I'd like you to think of this not as an offer of help, but as a partnership proposal. You have something valuable to offer, and I have the means to make it viable. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement." Melissa didn't respond immediately, but Richard noticed that his words had planted a possibility that she wouldn't easily dismiss. The real turning point, however, occurred on a rainy Sunday, almost 2 months after the first meeting with Lily. Richard had invited mother and daughter to have lunch at his apartment, something that had already become relatively common in their shared routines. While Walter prepared the meal, a surprising skill of the driver that Richard had recently discovered, Lily insisted on showing Richard a new exercise she had invented, especially for him. "It's the most important of all," she declared with the seriousness she always assumed when talking about her lessons. "But you have to promise you'll do exactly as I say." "I promise," replied Richard, captivated by the girl's enthusiasm. Melissa watched from the kitchen, dividing her attention between the conversation of the two and the preparation of the dessert she had brought. A caramel flan that was her specialty. "First you have to stand up," announced Lily. The unusual request made Richard hesitate. Since the accident, he rarely stood up, even with support. The few times he had tried during physical therapy sessions had been frustrating and painful experiences, reinforcing his conviction that he would never again support his own weight. "Lily, you know that's difficult for me." "You promised," insisted the girl. "And you have the parallel bars that the doctor had installed. You showed me yourself in the exercise room." It was true. Richard had invested in complete physical therapy equipment for his home, although he rarely used it lately. The parallel bars, which would allow him to support himself by his arms while trying to move his legs, were practically untouched. Under Melissa's concerned gaze, who had now abandoned the kitchen to accompany them, Richard allowed himself to be guided to the room adapted for exercises. Lily seemed to know the environment perfectly, the result of many previous visits in which she had explored every corner of the apartment with the natural curiosity of her age. "Walter can help you stand up at the bars," she suggested, calling the driver, who promptly offered to assist. With Walter's help, Richard positioned himself between the parallel bars, securing his hands on the supports and allowing the driver to sustain him while he adjusted the weight on his inert legs. The sensation was simultaneously familiar and strange. The body recognized the position, but protested against it with a mixture of discomfort and alarm. "Now Walter can slowly let go," Lily directed. "You can hold yourself up alone on the bars." Richard felt Walter's support gradually diminish, until he was supporting his own weight entirely with the strength of his arms. His legs, without neurological command, remained immobile but passively supported the weight like lifeless columns. "Very good," applauded Lily, displaying a radiant smile. "Now comes the most important part. Close your eyes." Richard obeyed, still concentrating all his energy on maintaining stability between the bars. "Now imagine that your legs are strong again. Don't try to move them yet. Just feel how it was when they obeyed you." Lily's voice, normally childish and animated, had assumed an almost hypnotic tone. Richard allowed himself to be guided by her, evoking muscle memories from a time when standing was an unconscious, automatic, free act. "Breathe deeply and remember all our lessons. All the times you imagined walking, running, dancing, all of this is stored in your body even if you don't know it." Richard felt drops of sweat running down his forehead with the effort of keeping himself upright. But there was something different in that moment, a sensation he hadn't experienced for a long time. Instead of the usual feeling of defeat and limitation, he felt strangely connected to his entire body, including the parts that no longer responded to his commands. "Now," continued Lily, "I want you to try to feel your feet touching the ground. Don't try to move them, just feel." Richard concentrated, seeking any sensation, however slight, in the feet he hadn't felt for 3 years. Initially, there was only the familiar emptiness, the neural disconnection that doctors had explained was permanent and irreversible. Then, something happened. It wasn't a movement. It wasn't even a clear physical sensation. It was more like a spark, a distant echo of consciousness in the long, silent extremities. Perhaps it was just his imagination, stimulated by the visualization exercises that Lily had made him practice for weeks. Perhaps it was some kind of sensory illusion, a trick that the brain plays when it desperately seeks what it has lost. But for Richard, at that moment, it was real. His eyes opened abruptly, meeting the expectant gazes of Lily, Melissa, and Walter. "Felt?" he murmured, his voice trembling with emotion. It was like a tingling, very light, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Lily's face lit up with a triumphant smile. "I knew it. I told you that you would walk again." Melissa approached, her expression divided between concern and contained hope. "Richard, are you sure? I don't want you or Lily to be disappointed." But there was something in Richard's gaze, a nascent certainty that went beyond the rational skepticism that had accompanied him for so long. "I don't know if I'll walk again, Melissa, but I felt something I haven't felt for 3 years. That, in itself, is already a miracle that medicine said was impossible." The effort to remain upright was beginning to take its toll. With Walter's help, Richard returned to the wheelchair, physically and emotionally exhausted by the experience. During lunch, the conversation revolved around that extraordinary moment. Lily was radiant, convinced that her promise was beginning to be fulfilled. Melissa alternated between cautious moderation and silent hope, while Walter observed everything with an expression suggesting that perhaps he had witnessed more than a simple visualization exercise. It was only when Lily fell asleep on the sofa, after dessert, that Richard and Melissa could speak openly about what had happened. "Did you really feel something?" she asked in a low voice, so as not to wake her daughter. "Or was it just not to disappoint Lily?" Richard reflected before answering, wanting to be absolutely honest not only with Melissa but with himself. "I felt something different. I can't state with certainty that it was a real physical sensation in my legs. It could be some type of psychosomatic response, the result of weeks of intense visualization. But Melissa," he hesitated, seeking the right words to express what that experience had meant. "Even if it was just my brain creating an illusion of sensation, that's still more than any doctor predicted would be possible. And more important than that, for the first time since the accident, I felt genuine hope. Not just resignation, not just rational acceptance of my condition, but true hope." When he opened his eyes again, he found Melissa observing him in silence for a few moments, her eyes reflecting a deep understanding. "I think that's what Lily meant from the beginning. When she said she was going to teach you to walk again, maybe she wasn't talking literally about your legs." The observation hit Richard like a revelation. All this time, he had interpreted Lily's promise in a literal way, while the true lesson was much deeper. She was talking about moving forward, about inner movement, not outer. Melissa nodded, a soft smile illuminating her face. "My daughter has always seen beyond the obvious. Even when I thought I was just protecting her from the harshness of the world, she was absorbing lessons that even I didn't completely understand." A comfortable silence established itself between them, filled only by Lily's peaceful breathing as she slept. It was a moment of communion that transcended words, the mutual recognition that something significant had changed, not just for Richard, but for all of them. It was Richard who finally broke the silence with a question that had been forming in his mind for weeks. "Melissa, have you ever thought about what it would be like if our lives had crossed under other circumstances? If we had met at the university, for example, when we both were studying business administration?" The question, laden with unrealized possibilities, hung between them like a promise. Melissa didn't respond immediately, her eyes fixed on her sleeping daughter, as if seeking in her the courage to face a future different from what she had planned. "I believe that each encounter happens exactly when it should happen," she finally replied. "Neither before nor after. Time is perfect in its imperfection." Richard let those words sink in, recognizing in them a truth that went beyond simple philosophical consolation. There was genuine wisdom in the acceptance of the present moment, as the only one truly available, a lesson he had forgotten in his obsession with what he had lost in the past. "You're right, and I'm grateful that our encounter happened now, even if through improbable circumstances." Melissa smiled, a smile that contained vulnerability and strength in equal measure. "Me too, Richard. Me too." That afternoon marked the beginning of a deeper transformation in the lives of the three, not just because of the possibility, still uncertain and nebulous, that Richard might experience some physical recovery, but because of the growing certainty that true miracles occurred in the invisible territory of human connections. In the weeks that followed, Richard continued with the exercises recommended by Lily, now complemented by sessions with a new physical therapist, the first who didn't completely dismiss the possibility that some sensitivity might return, even if minimal. The occasional tinglings persisted, sometimes more intense, sometimes almost imperceptible. The doctors consulted again, spoke in cautious terms about partial recovery of secondary neural pathways, and cerebral plasticity, but avoided making definitive promises or predictions. For Richard, however, the true miracle wasn't in the possible physical advances, but in the internal transformation he was experiencing. The bitterness that had for so long been his constant companion had been replaced by a serene acceptance of the present and a genuine curiosity about the future, whatever it might be. 6 months had passed since that rainy afternoon when Lily was rummaging through garbage bags near Liberty Square. 6 months that transformed the lives of Richard, Melissa, and Lily in ways none of them could have predicted. The headquarters of Donovan Technology, an imposing glass and steel building in Philadelphia's financial center, buzzed with the characteristic agitation of Fridays. On the top floor, the main meeting room was occupied by the company's administrative board, discussing the latest quarterly results. The atmosphere was one of contained optimism. The numbers showed consistent growth, new projects had been successfully implemented, and the company had regained the innovative momentum that had characterized it before its founder's accident. The head of the table, Richard Donovan, conducted the meeting with an energy that surprised even those who had known him for years. It wasn't just the renewed gleam in his eyes or the more upright posture in the wheelchair, but a subtle transformation in his entire presence, as if a long-extinguished light had been relit within him. The results of the social responsibility program have exceeded our expectations, he announced, moving to the next item on the agenda. The First Steps project is already operating in 3 communities, offering computer science and entrepreneurship classes for young people and adults in vulnerable situations. On the main screen, images of newly installed computer laboratories in public schools in peripheral regions of the city illustrated his report. The program, conceived and implemented in record time, had become a personal priority for Richard in recent months. Our next goal is to expand the program to include complete university scholarships for the 5 best students from each class, with a guaranteed internship at the company and the possibility of permanent employment after graduation. Robert Mitchell, the oldest member of the board and Richard's personal friend, couldn't contain a smile of approval. 3 years ago, when the accident had occurred, he had feared that the company would never recover the visionary spirit that characterized it. Now he was witnessing not just the recovery of that spirit, but its evolution into something more comprehensive and meaningful. The costs of the program are detailed in the report that everyone received, continued Richard. As you can see, the investment is substantial, but the returns, both in terms of corporate image and human potential, fully justify the allocation of resources. The presentation continued with technical discussions about other projects and investments, but Richard's heart was beyond that room. Although he remained completely present and engaged in the meeting, part of him was anxiously awaiting its end, because that night would be special. When the meeting finally ended, it was already past 6 in the afternoon. As the executives withdrew, Robert remained for a private conversation with his friend. "You look well, Richard. Better than I've seen you in years." Richard smiled, recognizing the observation as much more than a casual comment. Robert had been one of the few people who had persistently tried to break through the barrier of bitterness he had erected after the accident. For years, his efforts had been met with distance and at times poorly disguised hostility. Now, finally, he could see that his friend's concern had been genuine. "I am well, Robert, really. This social project, it's not just corporate philanthropy, is it? It seems personal to you." Richard hesitated, considering how much he should share. In recent months, he had kept his relationship with Lily and Melissa relatively private, protecting it from the curious and inevitably judgmental gazes of the social and professional circle in which he moved. "Let's say I've learned some important lessons recently, about second chances and new paths." Robert nodded, respecting the boundaries his friend established. "Well, whatever it is, it's working. The company is at its best moment in years, and you seem alive again." The observation, similar to what Melissa had made months before, deeply touched Richard. "Thank you, Robert, for not giving up on me even when I had given up on myself." The 2 men said goodbye with a handshake that carried the weight of years of friendship tested, and finally reaffirmed. When Robert left, Richard turned his chair to the panoramic window, contemplating the city that stretched below, dotted with lights at the beginning of the night. Philadelphia seemed different now, no longer a distant scenario observed through the invisible barrier of his bitterness, but a living, pulsating space, filled with interconnected stories. Somewhere in that sea of lights was Highland Hills, where a small house with blue windows awaited his visit. Walter entered the room silently, respecting his boss's contemplative moment. "The car is ready, sir, and the arrangements you requested have been delivered." "Thank you, Walter. We can go." The journey to the restaurant where they had arranged to meet was peaceful, the city already free of the rush-hour congestion. Richard took advantage of the time to mentally review the last few months and the changes that had occurred in his life. The advances in his physical condition, although modest by conventional medical standards, had surprised even the most skeptical specialists. The partial return of sensitivity in some areas of his legs, initially dismissed as impossible, was now documented in medical records and case studies. There were no guarantees that he would recover the ability to walk without support, but the possibility of some assisted mobility, previously completely ruled out, now figured in the horizon of possibilities. More significant, however, were the internal transformations. The company, which before had seemed just a burden to be managed, had once again become a source of purpose and fulfillment. The self-imposed isolation had given way to a gradual rediscovery of human connections, not just with Lily and Melissa, but with old friends, colleagues, and even distant family members with whom he had lost contact. And then there was Melissa. What had begun as gratitude for the way she had raised an extraordinary daughter had evolved into deep admiration for her strength, intelligence, and dignity. And, in recent months, into something more. A feeling that Richard still hesitated to name, but which he recognized as powerful and transformative. The restaurant chosen for that special night was in the Westbrook district, elegant without being ostentatious, with a welcoming atmosphere that privileged privacy. Richard had reserved a table on the mezzanine with a view of the internal gardens illuminated by soft lights. When he arrived, Melissa and Lily were already waiting for him. The sight of the two made his heart accelerate in a way that still surprised him. Lily, wearing a yellow dress that matched her sunny personality, ran to hug him as soon as she saw him. Melissa, in a simple but elegant blue dress, observed the scene with a serene smile. "You're late," exclaimed Lily, sitting next to his chair with the familiarity of someone who had found their place in the world. "I'm sorry, Princess. The meeting at the company went on longer than I expected." Melissa approached to greet him with a soft kiss on the cheek, a gesture that had become natural between them in recent weeks. "You look tired," she observed. "A little, but nothing that your company can't cure." Dinner proceeded in an atmosphere of contained celebration. There was much to celebrate that night, Lily's 7th birthday officially occurring the week before, but intimately celebrated only now. Melissa's approval in the selection process to return to the university with a full scholarship, and a special news that Richard was saving for the opportune moment. Between delicately prepared dishes and animated conversations, Lily related her adventures at school, where she had become a kind of celebrity since her method of teaching people to walk had been mentioned in a local newspaper. The article, which highlighted the unlikely bond between the businessman and the girl from the hill, had been careful not to exaggerate Richard's physical advances, but had recognized the remarkable coincidence between the beginning of the meetings and the improvement in his condition. "The teacher said I'll win a science prize if I continue studying medicine," Lily announced proudly. "She said I have natural therapeutic intuition, whatever that means." Richard and Melissa exchanged amused glances. Lily's ability to assimilate complex terms and repeat them with precision was just one of the many talents that made her extraordinary. "It means you see things that others don't see," explained Richard, "like when you saw that I could improve even when all the doctors said otherwise." Lily's face lit up with the compliment. "I just said what I already knew in here," she replied, pointing to her own chest. "Some things we know without needing to study." The simple wisdom of that observation made Melissa smile with maternal pride. "And some things we need to study a lot," she added, taking advantage of the opportunity for a small lesson. That's why it's important that you continue to dedicate yourself in school, even being so intuitive. When dessert was served, an elaborate chocolate cake that made Lily's eyes widen with pleasure, Richard felt it was the moment to share the news he had saved for the end of the night. "I have a surprise for you two," he announced, reaching for a folder that Walter had discreetly placed beside his chair. "A present?" asked Lily, immediately interested. "In a way, yes, but it's a gift for the future." Richard opened the folder and removed some documents, which he handed to Melissa. She examined them with growing surprise, her expression changing from curiosity to incredulity. "Richard, this is. The deed to an apartment in the St. Anthony neighborhood," he confirmed. 10 minutes from the university where you'll study and 15 from Lily's school. It has 3 bedrooms, a recreation area in the building, and 24-hour security." Melissa turned pale, clearly speechless at the magnitude of the gesture. "I can't accept this," she finally managed to say, her voice almost a whisper. "Yes, you can," exclaimed Lily, who had gone around the table to peek at the documents. "Mom, it has a swimming pool. I've always wanted to learn to swim." Her daughter's excitement contrasted with Melissa's evident internal conflict. Richard, who had anticipated this reaction, hastened to explain. "It's not a gift in the traditional sense, Melissa. It's an investment, in you, in Lily, and in the future we can build together. It's too much, Richard. Our friendship doesn't require this type of—" "It's not about requirement or obligation," he gently interrupted. "You taught me, through Lily, that there are many ways to walk in life. Some of them involve removing unnecessary obstacles from the path of extraordinary people." Melissa's eyes shone with contained tears. Lily, noticing her mother's emotion, held her hand in a surprisingly mature gesture of support. "Mom always says we shouldn't accept big gifts from strangers," commented the girl seriously. "But Richard isn't a stranger, is he? He's family now." The observation, made with the direct simplicity characteristic of Lily, hit the heart of the matter. Melissa looked at her daughter, then at Richard, and finally at the documents in her hands. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice firmer now. "Not just about the apartment, but about us, about everything this means?" Richard had never been so sure of anything in his life. "I am. You two taught me to walk again, not just with my legs, but with my heart. I can't imagine continuing this path without you by my side." A slow, luminous smile formed on Melissa's face, dispelling the last shadows of hesitation. "Then, I think we have a new home." Lily applauded enthusiastically, attracting amused glances from the other restaurant clients. Her world, always built on the solid foundation of maternal love, was now expanding to include new possibilities and horizons. After dinner, they decided to take a walk through the city park before returning home. The night was particularly pleasant, with a gentle breeze and starry sky, a rarity in the city usually covered by light pollution. In the park, illuminated only by discreet lights along the main paths, Lily ran ahead, exploring every corner with the inexhaustible energy of childhood. Melissa and Richard followed further behind, she walking slowly beside his wheelchair. "I still can't believe everything that's happened in the last few months," commented Melissa, watching her daughter, who was now trying to count the stars, pointing to the sky with animated gestures. "Sometimes it seems like I'm living someone else's life," agreed Richard. "A much better life than the one I had resigned myself to accept." They reached a small lake, where the full moon reflected on the tranquil surface of the water. Lily had found other children and was playing with them near the shore, under the watchful eye of their parents. "You know what impresses me most?" asked Melissa, sitting on a bench beside Richard's chair. "It's not the physical improvement you've experienced, although that's incredible in itself. It's how you've changed inside, how your worldview has transformed." Richard reflected on the observation, recognizing its profound truth. "I think I was trapped in a chair long before the accident, a chair made of expectations, ambitions, limited definitions of success. The accident just made visible a limitation that already existed. And Lily helped you see that. Lily, and you too. You both showed me that there's much more to life than I allowed myself to experience." A comfortable silence established itself between them, filled only by the night sounds of the park and the distant laughter of the playing children. I wanted to show you something, Richard finally said, breaking the silence. Something I've been secretly practicing. Before Melissa could ask what he was referring to, Richard activated the brakes on his wheelchair and, with a surprisingly fluid movement, raised himself to a standing position. He leaned heavily on a special cane that Walter had discreetly placed beside the bench, but he was unequivocally standing, supporting part of his weight on legs that, months before, were considered irremediably paralyzed. Melissa's face lit up with a mixture of surprise and joy. "Richard, you didn't tell me you were already managing to." "I wanted it to be a surprise. It's still very limited. I can only take a few steps with full support, and only on good days. But according to the doctors, it's progress that defies all expectations." With visible effort, but even greater determination, Richard took 2 hesitant steps toward Melissa, who instinctively stood up to support him. When she held his arm, offering support, their gazes met with an intensity that transcended words. "You're walking," she whispered, tears of emotion shining in her eyes. "I'm walking toward you," he simply replied, "as I've been doing since the day we met." In that perfect moment, under the starry sky of Philadelphia, their lips met in a kiss that sealed not only the love that had grown between them, but the promise of a future built on foundations of understanding, respect, and renewed possibilities. Lily, returning from her explorations, found them like this, Richard standing supported by Melissa, both involved in an embrace that spoke of new beginnings and new paths. The girl smiled without surprise, as if she had always known this moment would come. "I told you I would teach you to walk again," she commented with the simplicity of someone just confirming an obvious fact. Richard and Melissa separated, smiling at the small figure who had been the catalyst for so much transformation. "You did," agreed Richard, extending his hand to include her in the embrace. "And you taught much more than that," as the 3 remained, united under the moonlight, each silently reflected on the extraordinary twists and turns that had brought their very different lives to this point of convergence. For Richard, it was the rediscovery of a world beyond self-inflicted limitations, the understanding that walking wasn't restricted to physical movement, but encompassed the inner journey toward acceptance and growth. For Melissa, it was the confirmation that sacrifices made for love were never in vain, and that delayed dreams could flourish again in the fertile soil of new opportunities. And for Lily, in her childish wisdom that transcended adult understanding, it was simply the natural course of things, the realization of a truth she had always known, even when everyone around her doubted. The future opened before them like an illuminated path, not without challenges certainly, but full of possibilities that none of them had dared to imagine 6 months before. A path they would walk together, step by step, discovering that the greatest distances are overcome not by speed, but by persistence, by faith, and by love that transforms each obstacle into an opportunity for growth. As they left the park, Richard, again in his wheelchair, for some journeys still required support and time, and Lily asleep in Melissa's arms, the city seemed to embrace them with its twinkling lights, like a silent witness to a new beginning that transcended the visible and invisible limitations that life sometimes imposes on us. And so, on the starry night in Philadelphia, 3 lives previously separated by social and circumstantial abysses now followed a common path, a path built not despite the differences but through them, transforming each limitation into a bridge, each challenge into a step toward a future where the true miracle wasn't walking again, but learning to walk in ways that the heart always knew were possible, even when the mind doubted.